Hello and welcome. This is Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode 23 with Cyberdisciple and Max Freakout. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about prohibition, not only specifically drug prohibition, psychedelic prohibition, but also some ideas I have and want to work out here about the larger culture of prohibition and the relation of that culture to the egoic possibilism state of consciousness as defined in the ego death theory. And then secondarily, this fits in with the larger project Max and I have been working on these podcasts of talking about pop-psychedelia and their responses, various pop-psychedelia responses to prohibition. So that's the overall aim of this episode. Max, did you have any comments at this stage, or should I dive right into the topic?
I wanted to ask, would you say this mainly comes from like a follow-on to the analysis of James Kent?
For me, it does. I was really inspired to start thinking about these ideas more from listening to his presentations in his final 10. And it came from really his point that his argument that, well, it's not even really an argument, his statement that modern Western culture and psychedelics are not compatible. And it got me thinking, what could that mean? Now, he means it in a certain way. He means that they're not scientific and not rational, and they cause psychosis. But I got thinking about how they're not compatible. Another way of thinking that they're not compatible. They're not compatible in that I think that Western modern culture in the West is defined very largely by putting off that ego death initiation, by staying in the possibilism, egoic realm and way of thinking as long as possible. And so in that sense, psychedelics are not compatible with Western culture, modern Western culture, because they are all about, or they should be all about, breaking out of that, breaking down that simple story of there only being the egoic possibilism state, and instead adding in the eternalism state, the eternalism worldview and mental model of time and control. So it does come out of listening to James Kent's work, and I think I realized that I started thinking through, both his critiques of pop psychedelia and the legitimization strategies that he defines there, the 3 legitimization strategies of James Kent, that there are people turn to the medical healing model, and people turn to a religious model, and people turn to a historical model to try to legitimize drug use in the face of prohibition. And it became kind of clear to me that those approaches and all the approaches in pop psychedelia, that they're not sufficiently addressing the problem of prohibition very directly at all. And for that matter, neither does James Kent. He kind of treats it as a given that the drug laws came about out of a natural reaction by society against the danger of psychedelics, as if they were this new thing that came about in the 60s, and then society reacted naturally against them by outlawing them.
So he's justifying prohibition in that sense.
I think so, yes. I don't think he probably wouldn't say that, but I think he absolutely is, especially by presenting it as a natural, normal reaction. But it's a justified reaction. But so this comes out of, so absolutely, this follows on from that project and is in a way kind of like wrapping up some of my thinking inspired by working through James Kent's arguments.
I think that's interesting given the almost total lack of any explicit mention of prohibition in all of those hours of podcasting that James Kent did.
Right. right. It's I was struck by that, and then similarly struck by that in the rest of the pop psychedelia stuff that we've been investigating for a couple of years now. It really does not talk about. They really do not talk about that. Right. And so I think the first argument I want to make is that kind of modern Western culture has increasingly become defined by by drug prohibition, but then more generally by prohibitionist style thought and style thinking.
But just on the face of it, wouldn't you say there's a contradiction there, given that the conditions of prohibition do appear to be loosening to some extent via cannabis legalization here and there, psilocybin legalization here and there? Wouldn't you say that contradicts that idea?
This is a great question. Yes, this is a great question. My response to that kind of argument that things are loosening, we're seeing legalization in certain places, is that it is based on a model of incremental change that is fitting in. It's fitting in drugs, cannabis and psychedelics, for example, it's fitting it into prohibition thinking. So that's really where prohibitionist thought or prohibitionist model of self or prohibitionist theory or something like that. The ideas I have here about that, what I mean when I say prohibitionist thinking, that's where really that comes in, that there is within prohibitionist laws and promote a model of thinking about the self that is focused upon preserving safety and security of the self, of the body and of the self. And the strategies of pop psychedelia and psychedelic science have largely been, in the recent decades, to emphasize the safety and the security and the healing benefit, the psychotherapeutic benefit of psychedelics when they are taken in controlled settings under strict guidelines. And so my response there is that what we're seeing primarily, or I think that there is a great danger of psychedelics becoming legalized or accepted, but in a way that does not lead to perhaps full legalization, that does not lead to, or that continues to. So on the one hand, yes, on the one hand, not lead to full legalization. I think that's a potential danger of, some people put forth a model of saying we want to legalize psychedelics only for therapists to be able to distribute, for example. That's an argument I've seen. Or they should be legal just for scientists to study these fascinating compounds, but not for people. We can't allow people to take them again, have them widely spread. It's often a kind of anti-60s argument. Kind of like, we tried that in the 60s, and then it didn't work, and the establishment reacted against it. So what we instead need is careful, proven science and therapeutic benefits that's the model. That's where things are going to. That's how we're going to get legalization through. The danger is that will be legalization for just a few, just in those specific contexts. And then the problem with those contexts is that they are not focused upon, the area that we're most interested in, which is the conversion, the breakdown of self-control, and the conversion to a new mental world model based upon internalism.
It sounds like a self-contradiction on the face of it. They're trying to end prohibition but also keep hold of prohibition at the same time, which is to contrast that with Michael Hoffman's uncompromising approach that he calls prohibition repeal, or prohibition, the illegalization of prohibition, which is like the extreme anti-prohibition angle.
That was a very striking moment in that interview that you did with him in 2007 on the Psychonautica podcast, when I think, learning about some of his very uncompromising views, and he seems to be against a model of incremental change, and instead for rapid change. That's what activists should be demanding, is rapid change. And I have been influenced by that and agree with that. So I think partly I'm restating certain things here in the light of exploring, in the light of just observing what is the general tenor of pop psychedelia, and James, for example, filtered through some of James Kent's work.
Right, I just wanted to share an anecdote. Like I just said about how there's something bluntly self-contradictory about this pop-psych approach to legalization, where they're trying to hold on to prohibition and let go of it at the same time. I recently saw something in the news media about saying that in Canada, even though they have legalized cannabis in that whole country, most people still get their cannabis from the black market. And I thought that sounds like a kind of self-contradictory doublethink. How could there be a black market in a country where they have legalized it? And what they mean is that they have legalized a very narrow supply channel and then declared that anything outside of that supply channel is illegal, which is, again, this kind of, it has this appearance of prohibition and relaxing prohibition happening at the same time.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a really great example of, to me, that's a great example of the problem of, yes, we might change a little law here and there, but there's not enough. That's not enough change. Right. You change a little law, but in fact, it's not just about that law. It's about the entire setup. The entire economic setup in that case, or the distribution setup. So perhaps a bit more on what I'm trying to define here, because I realize when I'm talking about prohibitionist thinking, etc., this is a big extension beyond just the legal concept of drug prohibition. But I think that's a good moment, that example you just brought up, of how, yes, they changed the law, but they just changed it a little bit, and in fact the black market still remains in place. Is a good example of that. That, there's of course the very familiar topic of, the drug schedules. That's the kind of baseline of what do we mean when we talk about prohibition. I think we're talking about the drug schedules first and foremost, illegalization of possession of these substances and consuming them, and manufacture of them and things like that. And that is tied to that an effect of that immediately is like a carceral problem, the problem of imprisoning people for such activities, and that's part of a specific strategy of drug prohibition, to imprison people for having drugs. So you have the problem of physically locking people away. You have the mental fear that induces in people of such imprisonment, and then in some countries around the world there are death penalties for drug possession and drug use.
Yeah, like the Philippines is a noted current example of that.
Yeah, it sounds well, who knows what to trust in the news, but it sounds ghastly, right? I mean, people being kind of reported and killed on the street and things like that.
Yes, extrajudicial execution.
So, right, yes, exactly. And so there are real kind of horror stories that are, that to me make it a pressing moral problem. The problem of drug prohibition, people being in prison for little amounts of possession and things like that.
But do you feel like the pop-psych approach to legalization doesn't address that? It doesn't fix those horror stories?
No, there are, well, I'm not everything here. I'm not trying to bring up, everything I'm bringing up here is not necessarily, so it's coming out backwards. Not everything here that I'm bringing up is meant to be a ding against pop-psych. There are, there are great anti-drug war activist groups and things like that who do report these statistics. This is how I learn about most of them, is following some organizations that are in favor of changing drug laws, and they're very plugged into the problem of incarceration. They're very plugged into the problem of extrajudicial killings in different countries and things like that. I think it's just I'm just trying to be clear on what I'm talking about here, and that starts with the illegalization and the imprisonment, and punishment, I suppose. The illegalization of the substances and punishment, and I think that then, that's our starting basis for talking about prohibition. But then it expands outwards to fairly economic factors. You have a lot of people getting very rich off of drug prohibition. You have economic, so they're just starting from fines that the state collects for drug use or for being captured with drugs. You have police grants, judicial grants, and incentives to bust more people for drugs. There's the larger problem of for-profit prisons run by private companies that are making money, have an incentive to imprison more people. People's taxes go to the drug war. There's the problem of asset seizure. And then there's, like you alluded to in that example from the Canadian news story, there's the whole economy of drugs, the markets of drugs. So it sets up a certain economy. It's not as if there's no drug selling at all, but there's a certain economy of drug selling that is not is its own market, perhaps we could say.
It reminds me that there's an expression that Michael Hoffman is fond of, which is the prohibition for profit gravy train.
Right. So it's not, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. I think maybe my point here is that oftentimes when we're talking about changing society and decriminalizing or legalizing things, I often see little mention of for example, details about or addressing the economic pressures involved. And so I think that I think that I'm trying to bring in here what I think is important and missing from a lot of the discussion that I see. So in addition to the economic area, there's the political area that we touched on briefly, the politics of fear and protection. We have seen leaders in politics assert that they're strong on drugs and tough on drugs, and that's part of what helps get them elected. That's part of their means of gaining power and holding on to power is a politics of fear and convincing people that they're there to keep them safe. You have there's a scourge of drugs in your neighborhood, and your local politician is going to keep you safe from them, and that's why you should continue to vote for them. So there's very much a political dimension to the drug war as well, that people are invested in and want to see continuing on. And I think that's an example. Perhaps we could say that that's a disingenuous side of things. People saying that they want to keep people safe when in fact their motive may be something different. Their motive may be staying in power. Their motive may be the profit that the economic setup of the drug war allows and opens up to certain people. There is also, outside of individual countries, there's also the question of international power and leverage. I mean, the things having to do with the drug war get brought up, and I'm just familiar with the kind of USA relations with other countries. My point here is that it's not merely dealing with the problem of prohibition is not merely about changing a little law here and there. It is I think a larger problem, and I think keeping the focus on the larger problem is important. We're not merely trying to just decriminalize, a few mushrooms here and there. I think that there's, doing that is not going to make the larger issue go away.
Right. It's a comparison between two interpretations of prohibition, right? The pop-psych interpretation and then the radical ego death theory styled interpretation.
That's what I'm trying to like spell out what I think the more radical interpretation is and should be. And I would like to like try to drag pop psychedelia more over to the radical interpretation. I think most pop psychedelia is not radical enough in this front. There is a big target out there in the world that's drug prohibition, and there's a kind of unique opportunity for to go up against that prohibition or that psychedelia could do, and it's not doing that. I don't see it doing that.
No, there's an attitude of appeasement or compliance with prohibition in the pop psych world. They don't want to. There's a great unwillingness to take it head on.
There is, and I think that yes, it's kind of a comfortable activism. It's a very comfortable activism, and yeah, yes. So some of my like listing of things here is really just meant as a reminder that the problem with drug prohibition is a very well, I think it's a serious problem, is a large problem. It's not simply about whether or not a few people are able to trip on drugs or not and have to worry about the police coming and knocking down their door. It's a larger issue, larger problem of local politics and state politics and international politics. I mean, there are military operations that are carried on related to the drug trade, for example, in different parts of the world. I remember seeing an article years ago about, U.S. Army forces in Afghanistan protecting opium fields, for example.
Yeah, the war in Afghanistan turned Afghanistan into a major world supplier of heroin, which it hadn't previously been. There was the Taliban in charge before the war. They were very strict and they had cracked down on the poppy trade. So it only became such a major international supplier of heroin because of the war and then the politics of what the American troops were doing.
Right. So there's exactly. So there's this there's also this global context for it all. I mean, we already mentioned the Philippines and then beyond that. So I mean, that's really just dealing with the specifics of drug prohibition itself and the drug war and the larger implications of it. I suppose one of my connected arguments and an idea I've had for some time is that the model of drug prohibition and the drug war, especially its focus on its messaging about safety and security and its message to people that they need to essentially police themselves. I think of a lot of the anti-drug awareness programs that I, as a child, I was exposed to. They're really focused on policing yourself and making sure that you don't get addicted to things and lose control in that way.
That's the thinking behind Just Say No, yeah, self-policing.
Yeah, no, precisely. Like the Just Say No, the DARE campaign, the This Is Your Brain on Drugs sort of thing. They're very focused on individual choices and saying, well, you have a choice you have to make about whether or not you're going to expose yourself to this, and here are all the dangers of starting to use drugs. I mean, usually presented as this amorphous mass of drugs, as if all drugs were the same, and or all the drugs that have been made illegal are the same, right? As if drugs were uniquely, certain drugs were more uniquely addictive than other things that are legal. And so there's a health aspect. I think a health messaging that's kind of getting people to focus on your own individual health and securing it and keeping it safe.
Right, and you mentioned choice as well, like personal choice. That's an interesting contrast with Michael Hoffman's modeling of, in the ego-death experience, it feels as if it wasn't a choice to take drugs. That actually there was...
were led, your timeline led you to take it.
It was inevitable, as opposed to something that you chose to do, that you could have chosen otherwise. There was never a choice not to take drugs, which is directly against this prohibitionist message of just say no.
Right, the timelessly or deterministically elected people who were chosen to take drugs and recognize their own puppet-like status. I think too of the common image in, I would assume worldwide, but very specifically in the ancient Mediterranean, of the snake going up to the cup to drink from the cup, which Michael so greatly interprets as the world line, the snake world line, leading up to initiation by drinking the entheogen cup. I think there's a banqueter, like a Greek symposium banqueter on a bench staring at the cup and the snake coming up to drink from the cup, as if everything were leading up to that. So the contrast then with the messaging of that kind of like public health front of the drug war, right, is about how they're dangerous to your physical and your mental health. There's addiction possibility, and you've got a choice on you've got to police yourself, and also you should police other people as well. You should. I remember that being a part of the messaging too. Is you also need to encourage your friends not to do it as well, in a way, like tell on them if they're doing that, if they're taking drugs of some sort. Which the point I'm trying to move into now is that an idea I've had for some time is that the model of prohibition, especially its focus on safety and security, has been a template for other political and social movements and messaging. I think specifically like the war on terror from the U.S. perspective is very much focused on, it has that same message of the government is going to keep you safe. The authority is going to keep you safe. There's a threat out there which we need to beef up national security to take care of. And it's very much the same, very similar messaging to the war on drugs in the U.S., that there are people out there, drug dealers, there are this dangerous substance that we need to protect you from, and we need to empower the forces in the society to protect everyone from these things. The same rhetoric of safety and fear and of surveillance
and control from a higher authority.
Yes. We're seeing that these days right now with the fear of viruses spreading around, and what can we do? How can you stop the spread of a virus? Well, there's a great impetus to control and lock down. That's the response. That's the accepted response by most states and people. And that has an analogy, I think, to the, what do we do about this threat? The threat of drugs, the threat of, shadowy terror entities, the threat of other states, the threat of a virus. Well, we need to shut down and control.
Right, yes.
And so that, you can see where we've already been alluding to it, but then that leads me to the idea that there's a distinct analogy between what I'm calling the prohibitionist mindset and the egoic possibilism control model, the uninitiated control model, which so much wants to put off enlightenment and put off death and put off revolution. It wants to retain control and retain its sense of self, and will spin and spin as much as possible to avoid giving up control and acknowledging that it's not in control.
Right. It says something about the fragility of the ego structure, that it requires this over-the-top, exaggerated control system to try to protect it from discovering eternalism.
Interesting. Yes, it's a whole method of putting off eternalism. Kind of a great hierarchy of trying to put off eternalism and having to give that up.
There's something that sometimes confuses me when I read Michael Hoffman's writing about prohibition, is I wonder if he's talking about prohibition just of psychedelic drugs or of drugs in general. And, when we're talking about the egoic world model protecting itself from eternalism revelation, that really is just a case of psychedelic prohibition over the top of anything else, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's true. When we might call that category visionary plants in the main article. And that's not only psychedelic mushrooms, of course, and LSD. I think he includes cannabis, but other plants as well. Salvia divinorum, henbane, belladonna, datura. But he doesn't, I mean, there's no mention of, say, other drugs that factor heavily in the drug war, like cocaine and opium and heroin. But do recall, I mean, I think he has written saying, like, I would never put down any of these drugs or something like that. I would never, disparage any of them. I think as a kind of hardline move, like, no, we can't allow it, if you allow an inch to the kind of prohibitionist idea and prohibitionist rhetoric, they'll take it all the way.
And also he emphasizes the newness of prohibition and how society managed just fine for hundreds of years without any kind of prohibition in place. And it's a very modern, recent, synthetic thing rather than something that has always been going on. I think there's probably an assumption, unstated and implicit in a lot of people's minds, that prohibition has always been the case. Not a lot of people would really do the research into the history of prohibition and find out that it's barely 100 years old, rather than just assuming that society would always have had to protect its citizens from drugs. Or perhaps even an assumption that even if prohibition hasn't always happened, that drugs themselves are a new thing, and that because previous societies, previous ages didn't have drugs, there was no need for such a thing as prohibition. Whereas Michael Hoffman's picture of history is that drugs were always there with human beings, but they were just never prohibited until very, very recently in history.
And certainly not by some sort of centralized power like is capable in the 20th century and 21st century. I mean, there's simply not apparatus simply was not possible, and the enforcement mechanisms simply did not exist in the same way. They simply were not possible in the same way in pre-modernity as they are in the 20th century and 21st century.
Except there's something of a contradiction to that in the pop-psych narrative coming from Terence McKenna, who I don't necessarily think is absolutely typical. I think he's a bit more radical than pop-psych, but not that much more radical. But his idea, which he expresses in his book Food of the Gods, was that Alaric the Visigoth and the Goths came and ransacked Eleusis and smashed it to pieces, and that was the old antiquated version of a centralized power structure coming and prohibiting psychedelic ceremonies from happening.
Right. We've discussed that in an earlier episode, I believe. I guess I would have loved to ask Terence McKenna if he thought that Alaric the Visigoth did not have access to psychedelic plants, and if he was essentially a modern prohibitionist or an early version of the prohibitionist for profit gravy train. Is that what he's imagining? It's hard to know precisely.
I don't think the profit motive was there. I think Terence McKenna was suggesting it was more a kind of moral motivation to do that rather than a profit-seeking motivation. But what you're saying is that there simply wouldn't have been these kind of centralized structures. It wouldn't. The government of the society was quite fundamentally different to how it is now. Would you say?
Well, again, different times of different places have different strategies and different amounts of centralized control. But one thing that comes up in studying the history of the Roman Empire as one great debate is to what extent do we tend to think of the Roman Empire as a militaristic society that had a very top-down hierarchical structure, which it certainly did, but this comes up just in normal history classes. We tend to project back a very centralized, very controlled network, but historians have pointed out that simply is not that simply was not possible, both technologically, communication wise. There's not that level of concentration is simply not possible in a pre-industrialized world. the level of like coordination across all of the Mediterranean to say that, oh, the Roman Empire did something. That the Roman Empire, like the emperor decided somewhere in the middle of Rome or wherever the emperor happened to be to enact a legislation that affected all of the Roman Empire immediately and at the same time, and that they could control and police every citizen and every person within its borders. It simply didn't work that way. That was simply just not possible. That's a historical interpretation that I have become convinced by, outside of studying ego theory.
Right. So the Roman Empire didn't function as a state in the way that people imagine it did.
There certainly was a state, absolutely, but not. We tend to project back our modern sense of state, which is far more powerful and more involved in people's lives, I think, than we tend to project that back sometimes when we are talking about the possibility. I mean, to bring it back to the drug prohibition question, Michael, I think, is very right that there's no laws against taking drugs, for example, in ancient Greek city-states or in the Roman Empire. That's simply a modern projection that they must have made them illegal. Otherwise, we would hear about them more. And I mean, we can see that even more clearly in more recent centuries. Michael, I think part of Michael's point, if you look at the history of prohibition, it starts in America, at least in, like, say, the 1920s is when it really gets going. And I'm not just talking about about alcohol prohibition here. I'm talking about, drug prohibition.
I think it started with cocaine and opium, if I remember correctly.
Perhaps even before the 20s. Yeah, because there's the whole opium wars. Now, I'm no expert in the history of drug prohibition. Here I am talking about it so much, but but it's more about the general. It's more about the general cultural approach, I think. We're saying it's starting with cocaine and opium. Well, again, all this is happening very recently. And what was the situation beforehand? In the early 19th century.
I mean, in the early 19th century, I know there's this famous shop in London, Harrods. Apparently, you could just go into Harrods and buy ultra pure cocaine and heroin just over the counter very easily. Right up until sometime after World War I, that was the case. So there was a completely different... And you can see... some places you can see there's photographs of the packaging. They even used to have, like... products that were designed to be given to children to stop them crying, that were basically opium based to babies when housewives would be fed up with having screaming children around the house, so they'd be advertised these products that it will give them some opium and they'll be fast asleep and you can get on with your day. Like crazy, the difference in attitude at the beginning of the 20th century compared to just a couple of decades later.
Yeah And there's a great I think that there's a great lesson there, and also the power of messaging and media that has developed over the 20th century, that it seems like people's attitudes could be so completely changed in a rather short period of time. I don't mean that I don't mean that necessarily in a conspiratorial way, but that the culture kind of shifted into this prohibition model, and from a number of different factors. But where was I? My kind of outline here. I was linking prohibitionist society. I was making a case for a prohibitionist society that's focused upon safety and security, and that this is related to drug prohibition, the increased focus on safety and security, and that each citizen needs to police themselves and other people to keep society safe.
So it's safety-oriented society.
Yes, a safety-oriented society is essentially a prohibitionist society. That's the kind of model of society that prohibitionist laws and prohibitionist economic activities and health activities and political activities want and encourage. And that has been exported to other areas of life, and that this is consonant, this is analogous to the egoic model of control and power, of keeping oneself safe and secure, not ingesting anything that could possibly challenge that safety and security, and protection, and not not converting to the other side of going over to the other side and having to deal with eternalism and its consequences for the ego, the actual death of the egoic model, or that feeling that can be so easily and readily analogized as death and dying. So returning then to pop psychedelia and James Kent. Now, my sense is that a lot of pop psychedelia, and I think to be more specific, here I'm not really talking about, say, like drug policy activists, so to speak, or people interested in kind of stopping the drug war. I'm talking more about the cultural, kind of more cultural figures, and talking about what psychedelics are good for. This, a lot of the drug policy advocates and or drug policy reform advocates, I should say, and anti-prohibitionists, their goal is just, from what I can tell in the U.S. at least, is just to stop the laws, change the laws in some form, stop drug prohibition, and stop the various harm it's causing, like with imprisonment and fines and stuff like that, asset seizure, etc. But with pop psych, we're really talking about like people that we've been describing who are trying to define what psychedelics are used for. And those people, as we were saying earlier, are generally only asking for a small modification of prohibition. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the episode. They're looking for a small change of laws to allow for therapy or microdosing or science. And another feature of that we were pointing out is that there's a substitution. They're substituting in another goal for taking psychedelics besides full-blown ego death and mental model conversion. And I think the result of this just asking for a small change of laws and the result of substituting in another goal besides full-blown mental model conversion is something that is in compliance with. It results in compliance with the safety and security and protection model of self, of society and self.
Yeah, it goes further than that. Not only do they advocate these alternative goals like healing, psychotherapy, microdosing for productivity, but they also seem to imply that the ego death panic attack thing is actually not something bad to be avoided completely, and almost like an inconvenience that you might that might happen to you, which is why microdosing seems to be like a guaranteed way of avoiding that kind of thing happening.
Right, taking like a minuscule amount and with a stated goal of being somehow to promote one's own productivity or creativity or wellness or something like that. Which is, in a way, also those are goals that involve putting off, and as you say, like viewing the ego death panic attack possibility as something to be avoided.
I don't know if you've seen very recently, just in the last week or so, there's been a headline circulating in a few pop psych publications like Vice, saying something like, scientists trying to engineer a type of magic mushroom that never causes a bad trip. That's like the latest thing to come out of the pop psych world, and it's, you read the small print in the actual article and it's nonsense. There's no way to do that,
right?
But it's just it's the kind of goals, the kind of thing that they would like to do, the kind of things they fantasize about. If they could have a mushroom that was guaranteed to never cause a bad trip, that would do so much for the legitimization idea. You could just market this mushroom as the ultimate safe psychedelic drug.
Right. Which then, yeah, exactly. No, that's great. That's a great comment. That it's like that's like we want to avoid. It's like a change of goal. Yeah. And so that's bringing us back to kind of where we started with James Kent. He realized he's only a really small modification of the other pop psych models. He also is in favor of low doses and, as you say, like avoiding psychosis. He would love that, to be able to take a mushroom pill that doesn't cause, has no problem with psychosis, that would solve all of James Kent's problems.
Yes.
About psychedelics. And he questions whether society can handle psychedelics, for example, and handle that psychosis because of that, what he defines as a psychosis problem. And he's right to say that psychedelics are dangerous. Well, because they are dangerous, because encountering the power of the divine is dangerous, right? That's not a safe thing to do. It is dangerous to your... initiation is dangerous. It just is. It's dangerous to your sense of self. It's dangerous to your sense of who you are. And getting to the other side of that, I mean, that's why there's a whole... it really is completely new territory to have that ego-death experience. And there's a reason why the death model, the death analogy, is really apt for it, because it's... a displacement of everything that you thought you were, and a putting yourself over into the hands of the hidden thought source, a hidden controller, a hidden, recognizing that you were never in control in the first place. That's scary and dangerous. It's not safe. So they are dangerous. Encountering the power of the divine is a dangerous thing. But I think that then brings us to the topic of like bad trips, which seems, that's like a meme in psychedelic discussions, that some people say that bad trips can be really useful, and other people say, like James Kent is against that and thinks that no, bad trips are bad because they cause psychosis. But I think that there's something, I think you and I are more on the side of like bad trips are useful, except we would never use quite those terms. I think that what we mean is that it's almost like we have almost like the bad trip model needs to be really just kind of thoroughly expanded on, like, what does that actually mean? What we mean, they're like ego death, dissolution experience, and self-control seizure. It's not so much a bad trip. It's almost like we should just be using other terms entirely to talk about it. So it's like we have bad models of what psychedelics do to, like, philosophically and experientially to the self, to the ego, and we have bad models, or at least pop-psychedelia has bad models of what's on the other side. I say we have bad models. I'm speaking generically about widespread culture that hasn't taken up the ego death theory, which is of course the same old refrain that I always have, is people just need to be talking about Michael Hoffman's work and then we can move on.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
We can't move on until we talk about it, and I think that's partly what you're saying too, about people wanting to like avoid psychosis, avoid the shadow, avoid bad trips, so to speak, all these terms. Well, there's no avoiding them. If you want to take psychedelics, you have to have a model of what happens in them and deal with them and incorporate them. And so I mentioned this earlier, but my fear is that all these pop psych models, including James Kent, and his apparent model of what he thinks psychedelics are for, which is just kind of low dose recreation, vague insights, kind of, having cool times with the perceptual change. All of these are like, the danger is that all of that James Kent model, all the various pop psychedelic models could be incorporated into, like, Prohibition has a way it could work to incorporate them, just as oftentimes movements that seem radical can get diluted and co-opted by the power that they are supposedly challenging.
Yeah, like Michael Hoffman characterizes the history of Christianity in that way, that it started off as a rebellious countercultural movement, but it was then co-opted into the Roman society.
Yeah, I think, yes, and that's a model of... that's a model I'm also familiar with from a lot of discussion about the hippie movement in America in the 60s and in other parts of the West, and the larger counterculture of the 60s in the kind of leftist critiques of capitalism end up getting incorporated into the model that they're trying to go up against.
Right.
And it's almost like the power is very good at co-opting, and I think that a lot of the pop psychedelia stuff. Well, if you look at it structurally, it's like the very thing that they're promoting, like low doses essentially, is the very thing that prohibition could actually modify and change to allow. It could allow, yes, we'll sell low doses that will not cause psychosis or go up against the control model, or yes, we'll sell it to therapists only to be used in a very controlled setting, or yes, we'll have a way of selling it to the public, but it'll be so constrained that the alternative markets or black markets will be more attractive to people.
Right. It strikes me that hasn't been thought through very well, because, so for example, the first example you gave is they could enforce microdosing or low dosing on everybody by only selling low doses, but that wouldn't stop someone from going to the shop twice and picking up 2 times low doses.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, no, I can see that. I hadn't thought through that. I think I was just pulling out how could the microdosing example be brought in.
Well, it seems to me that it's all about self-policing with zero component of external policing, by trying to say people should only want to do low dosing. If you only ever talk about microdosing and the amazing, miraculous benefits that supposedly come out of microdosing, then maybe everybody will only ever take microdoses. It seems like a kind of wishful thinking type of strategy to try to pray away the danger and make the danger never come up as a problem in the first place.
Oh, I see. It's almost like a media sort of strategy of we're going to talk about microdosing and its amazing benefits, and we'll see those books promoted, not necessarily in a nefarious way by anyone, but because that's what is attractive to people. That's attractive, the idea of getting miraculous benefits out of microdosing.
Yeah, getting all the benefits without having to do the hard work of world model transformation, just getting all these benefits, becoming, the way they describe microdosing in certain places, it's almost like some kind of miracle cure for anything that could possibly go wrong. A huge amount of PR and hype behind it, and but there's no teeth to back it up. That's the point I'm making, is that it wouldn't actually stop somebody. There's no way that you could incorporate that into an actual drug prohibition model of the kind that we have now to enforce low doses on everybody.
Well, tell me what you think of this. I mean, it seems to me a lot of the models that we're seeing of, say, physical healing, psychotherapeutic healing, the microdosing miracle promises, including productivity and creativity, recreation. A lot of those are also about trying to direct what the outcome is going to be of taking a psychedelic. They're saying, I'm going to take it to get X out of it. I'm going to take this in order to heal myself. I'm going to take this in order to explore my psychotherapy past and do some psychotherapeutic healing. And so all of those models are connected to something that's going to end up beneficial for me, beneficial for myself, in a very concrete way. I'm telling myself what that future benefit is going to be, and I'm going to achieve that. And thus, that's a possibilism or a egoic model of extending across time into the future and saying what I'm going to get out of doing this action now. Does that sound right, of that this is a future oriented and thus like kind of a use benefit and essentially an egoic sort of idea?
Yes, whenever I hear the word benefit coming out of pop psych, you can always just assume what it means is benefiting egoic functioning, benefiting the possibilism world model to continue into the future. It's entirely ego based.
Right. And often tied to this is going to be a safe thing that's going to preserve me for the future. I'm not going to die in the future. I'm going to be preserved. Even though I'm taking this drug, I'm going to be preserved and survive.
And I might even be able to make more money or be more healthy, be more happy afterwards. But one way or another, I will continue to be an ego into the future.
Right, and it will serve my my ambitions and my ideas about what I'm doing in the future, and my whole conception of all these choices I've made leading to certain points. Whereas, like, the idea of, I think that's one one aspect of ego death thinking, that ego death theory style thinking, that's really fun in a certain way, or ironic, is that we can pose as saying, well, yes, the benefit here is to get a control loss experience, except that that's not something you can really control in itself, right? There's some sort of benefit to having done that, but it's a benefit that is totally different from any sort of egoic benefit we could come up with.
Yeah, so it's a transcendent benefit, and in general, pop psych doesn't know anything about the transcendent benefits of psychedelic drugs. They are exclusively focused on the egoic benefits of psychedelic drugs.
And so I think my last set of points here I wanted to make have to do with the note I have here. So the problem of change in pop psychedelia's apparent theory of change, or even explicit theory in some cases, is a theory of incremental change working within the current system, as if the system itself can be reformed gradually.
But that's something I struggle to understand, because isn't there also another way of saying it, which is that even though the ego death experience feels like the end of the world and a transformation that is so total and so complete and so permanent that normal life will never be resumed afterwards, that perception of ego death comes from the pre-ego death possibilism perspective. But actually, when ego death resolves itself and the transcendent perspective is then present in the mind, actually, normal life does carry on very much as it did prior to the ego death experience. So it's almost like there's a fear of something which doesn't turn out to be the case. So you might say to yourself in the middle of a bad trip, I've gone insane and I'm going to be this way forever. I've completely screwed up my entire future. But that is never the case. The trip comes to an end and that belief turns out to be a mistake. So I guess what I'm saying is there were these other cultures in antiquity, like ancient Roman, Greek, ancient Egyptian culture, where psychedelic ego death would have been a totally standard rite of passage at a fairly young point in a person's life. But that didn't stop normal life, normal trade, for example, normal politics and warfare and sport and that kind of thing. All of those things still occurred in the antiquity psychedelic society that occur in the modern society. So the fear is unfounded. There's a fear in pop psych that they want incremental change because they want to avoid radical revision. But actually, that's a mistake, because the radical revision still accommodates ordinary life. It just adds a new spiritual dimension of it, which is only really explored in say fortnightly or monthly psychedelic ceremonies. But outside of that, normal life remains unaffected by ego death.
And it's not necessary to drop everything in one's normal life and convert to a whole new model of living one's egoic life.
Yeah, because I don't think there is a different model of living one's egoic life. Like, there's that famous Zen koan, which says, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. To put it in terms of James Kent, it almost seems like James Kent is praising this thing that he constructs called modern Western consumer culture, as if, and he's saying that psychedelic drugs are incompatible with that because they will destroy it. They will make everybody go psychotic. That's actually not the case. That you could do what Michael Hoffman is suggesting and fully repeal prohibition and make psychedelic drugs every bit as accessible as, say, alcohol or something like that. there's no reason that Western consumer capitalism, which James Kent loves so much, couldn't still carry on, even after prohibition repeal. That's how it looks like to me, as a person who once believed for a short space of time that ego death spelled absolute doom and gloom, bad trip that lasts forever, psychotic mayhem, potential suicide, that kind of thing. All of those beliefs that I once held in great panic and fear actually turned out to all be wrong. And sure, my life has been transformed and changed by the psychedelic ego death experience, but a lot of it has stayed the same. I'm still chopping wood and carrying water. I'm still participating in modern Western consumer capitalism because I like to eat nice food and have nice things and, and strive for success and that kind of thing. So it's a misplaced fear, I think, is what I'm getting at. There's the fear of radical revision, which pop psych is trying to avoid by espousing a model of slight incremental change as a future of how prohibition can come to an end. It's an unfounded fear because actually, I guess I'm contradicting James Kent's central point, which is this incompatibility. I'm saying surely they are fully compatible. It just involves adding a slight thing extra, which is this I guess psychedelic banqueting party or shamanic ceremony or trance festival, or however the hell it is that you want to do it. That part of life actually doesn't take up 24 hours 7 days a week. In the same, I think actually Michael Hoffman has made a similar analogy to sexuality, that you could envision a culture that prohibits sexuality and that you have to have sex through a small hole in a sheet and turn the lights out every time and never explore the kind of bacchanalian or hedonistic side of sexuality. But actually, it wouldn't destroy life if you did. Sexuality is only a very small part of life. It only takes up half an hour a day maximum, probably. The rest of the time life is as normal. Do you see what I'm getting at here?
That psychedelics don't need a particular societal setup one way or the other, that they fit in with any, these larger topics of, say, capitalism or a political framework, whether that's, democratic or authoritarian or, whatever, monarchical empire, weird, I don't know, ancient Spartan weird caste system. Like, all psychedelics can fit in with all of those. There's no particular societal setup that is appropriate for psychedelics. I think that the only thing I want to make is I think that I think it's that it doesn't fit in with prohibition.
Oh, of course.
It only can fit in with prohibition my point here is to highlight that the real point should be that they don't fit in with prohibition, and that they don't fit in with, or at least they can only be very uncomfortably fit in with prohibition, which is the state that we live in, right? Of people taking psychedelics in secret with a certain fear for their their actual freedom and autonomy to do so, and things like that. Right, but the James Kent point, I think, of he's worried about preserving. He sees that pop psychedelia is wants to advocate for some other sort of society, and thinks that psychedelics aren't compatible, therefore, with Western society. Yeah, I agree. There's no reason that they couldn't just fit into the way that things are now, except for the the problem of prohibition.
Yeah, except for prohibition. That's the one thing. So, in other words, if someone is actually claiming, say, it sounds like James Kent thinks that pop psych is claiming that there's some other model of society, some kind of psychedelic utopia on the other side of the end of prohibition. I would really like to interrogate what that's actually about. And I wonder if there really is such a thing, and if anybody really does have a clear idea of a post-psychedelic or a post-end of prohibition society, which is different from now. I suspect it's just the same. Maybe some people think that the end of prohibition would spell some kind of collectivist or communist utopia. Have you ever by any chance heard of a science fiction movie called They Live?
I have, yes.
Right, that movie very clearly makes that point that I've just said, that psychedelics spell the creation of a communist society. They clearly link in. In fact, that movie They Live backs up James Kent's point in that the people who are wearing these sunglasses, which they call them Hoffman lenses, right, which is an obvious reference to LSD, that those people are all communists, and the conversations they have clearly say that they're against the enemy of capitalism, and capitalism is the thing that's doing the prohibition, as if communists wouldn't also seek to prohibit psychedelic drugs.
Right.
The movie They Live turns it into a communism-capitalism type of dialectic, and maybe that's all there is to it. Maybe there's some kind of wishful thinking that if we legalize psychedelics, everybody would want to just share everything all the time and we could all be communists. But I don't really see any reason to think that would be the case, that if psychedelics were legalized, everybody would become more sharing and we would inevitably become communist.
I think that there's a problem of a problem of kind of overloading the problem or overloading the goal, and I think that's why I wanted to spend some time earlier trying to define more the what I think the problem of that like the societal setup of drug prohibition is a little bigger than just the laws. But I in fact wanted to come to as an ending point or a later point in this discussion was that it's not about I don't think this is about reforming every single thing in the world or changing every single thing in the world at all. I don't think resisting prohibition and changing it, advocating to change it, means that we're going to fix the entire world. I don't think that at all. I think that it's in fact the idea of having a more clearly defined target that is both, it's not too big and it's not too small. I mean, I think the idea of that we're going to use psychedelics somehow to overthrow capitalism that's a huge target. Like, what does that even, what are the specifics of that even look like? Or, using it to, I think that there are certain traps in activism. And I think I wanted to talk a little bit at the end here that there are certain traps, like an activist trap of wanting to fix everything in the world, that everything in the world is wrong and we need to fix it all.
Right.
And that's something that every individual person also needs to be doing. We have to fix environmental problems. We have to fix racial problems. We have to fix inequality problems in other areas of life. We have to fix economic problems. I mean, we have to do all of them. Each person has to do all of them at the same time. And I think that there's an activist problem. It's like a trap of then not accomplishing anything by setting the target too large. I think that's some of what you're alluding to, that it doesn't, the problem of getting psychedelics, I think the problem with psychedelics right now is twofold. One is like allowing them not being legal is just a basic problem, and then the problem of them not being, the larger cultural problem of them not being incorporated, the ego death experience caused or most easily induced by psychedelic drugs and other drugs, not being incorporated into thought and society and culture.
Yes.
And I think that there is, to return to the activist thing, it occurred to me this morning, right before coming here, that there's a reason that incremental change can be really attractive to some people. And I think that this is part of what I mean by like the activist trap, is that when you have a model of incremental change to societal laws, you can end up with like a kind of activist class of people whose livelihood and sense of self is wrapped up in the state of progressing towards change.
Right.
Because after that change has occurred, they cease to have a reason for doing that work anymore and of being those people.
So are you saying that they have a motivation to perpetuate this change but never actually realize it.
Ironically so for some people.
Yeah.
Knowingly so, probably for a certain amount of people. That there's a material interest in actually maintaining, of making a certain amount of change. And I wonder how much of the so-called new psychedelic renaissance is part of that. We've gotten things loosened enough culturally that now there's a group of people who can make their livelihood and have their social status and their careers off of it.
Right.
But if we just legalize everything, for example, say like there's a snap of our fingers and all psychedelics are legalized, they don't have the same reason for existing. They don't have the same reason for doing their job, and they lose the same social status if it's just kind of psychedelics stop being this specialized little area of life and just start being a part of people's lives. If we start conceiving them that way as just a part of cultures around the world's lives, which they really are.
Yes.
People are. There's people all over the world who are just doing psychedelics, and they are not necessarily the people who are speaking at psychedelic conferences or making, podcasts or starting nonprofits having to do with psychedelics. All those people have a vested interest in keeping psychedelics as a special niche thing and perpetuating that idea that they're this special thing that you need a special group of people to talk about.
Right.
That's what I'm getting about a kind of activist trap, is that, well, no, really, that shouldn't be why you're doing it. You don't need to. It's not a specialized career. It's not a specialized field. It's just a part of life and a part of society.
Got it. Yeah.
I think that's my latest thing on the problem with pop psychedelia. The creation of activists and businesses as well invested in a model of incremental change, or businesses, for example, that are able to kind of seize the moment of incremental change, like whatever the very narrow channel. I don't know the details of that article you referred to at the beginning of our talk here in Canada, but whatever very narrow channel, you have certain business or certain people who end up seizing that and they're in control of that. Well, they're not really they have a material interest in that channel not widening.
Yeah,
they want that channel to stay the same. They want it to continue to flow through them. It's just another model of the prohibition for profit gravy train.
Got it. Yes.
So what is to be done then? Well, my kind of speculative thinking is about prohibition and legalization is if I'm trying to make the claim that there's some sort of analogy with the egoic mental model, is there a way of applying the dynamics of conversion to a new mental model that the ego death theory describes to the problem of prohibitionist society? And it strikes me that in the ego death model, we could look to like mythic things as a way to do it. Now, this is all just like kind of picturesque speculation, but what happens? What's the like lightning model of change per the ego death theory? It's about the king bowing and surrendering. So instead of incremental change, what we want or should hope for or pray for is an immediate rescue, an immediate change. I'm saying this with a smile on my face, because what does that even look like in the real world? I don't know. But I think I seem to recall, for example, Michael Hoffman talking at one point about calling for just an immediate presidential pardon in the U.S. context. Presidential pardon of all the people who put in jail, returning of assets, immediate repealing of all the laws. Now, there's something to that works at both a mythic analogy type level, and I think that I'm no activist myself. I haven't necessarily thought through all these issues, but there's something wrong with the model of incremental change more broadly. I think not something wrong, but there's a danger to it. The model of will make incremental change in prohibition by including, showing how psychedelics are actually safe, or showing how we'll get the hard science first to prove that they're really safe and really worthwhile and things like that. I think that it's worth saying that that's not the only model possible. that's worth pushing against. So that's the end of my speculation. But I think it's important and very key thing missing from pop psychedelia.
Yes, definitely. I mean, do you think that what you're saying here leads to a model of activism, or does this just stay at the level of concepts and ideas? Do you think it suggests an actual practical way forward for activists, or not?
Well, I think that that for activists, for people actually addressing change, whether that's like professional activists or not, again, as I was saying earlier, I'm skeptical of the concept in a way, or struck by some of the contradictions maybe of professional activism, which there may be no way around. I don't know. But it strikes me that this model, or a model in the spirit of the ego-death theory, which is what we're trying to represent here, you and me, is to, I think, well, first of all, to like have a really clear definition of the problem and of the egoic problem, and as well a very clear model of change and of what's on the other side of that. And I think that maybe a further step from here is to talk about that issue that you were raising a couple minutes ago and talking about is, well, what do people actually imagine is on the other side of psychedelic prohibition, at least, if not full drug, or psychedelic legalization, if not full drug legalization.
There's a looming trap there, which is false promises, over-exaggerated promises about how wonderful and rainbow covered and amazingly blissful the world is on the other side of
right.
of this transformation, and maybe it's not going to live up to people's expectations, and then there's a sense of disappointment afterwards. Or we thought this would be so much better than this. So I think, there's an interesting comparison here of what goes on the individual level when a person discovers psychedelics and has their mind transformed, and then there's what goes on the societal level when a culture will embrace psychedelics and start to incorporate them into, it would have to be religious practice. It's when the common understanding of religion shifts from the exoteric model to the esoteric model of what religion is about.
Well, what you said earlier regarding, well, a couple things, I'm picking up on a couple things you said earlier. Maybe what should be said is that actually very little is going to change on the other side of repealing the drug laws.
Yes.
Because all it would be doing is going back to the a state of maybe 120, 150 years ago in terms of legality.
Yes.
And that there's actually very little that would change for people's lives. They simply would be able to take psychedelics and acquire them without, acquire them through legal means, without worry of being thrown into jail or fined. And they could have access, or readier access, to ideas of ego-death conversion, etc. Well, which I suppose people have ready access to already. So there's nothing actually that would change there at all. That's readily accessible. Just Google it. Look it up on the internet, you can find it. It's not hard. And so things would not actually change that much. This is like that's a really appealing way of putting it, I think, because it fits with that lowered expectations model, and that what you're bringing up about enlightenment is not, people have a lot of over expectations about what enlightenment is like, and that really it's not so different from normal. It's not so different from the pre-state. You're just entirely different afterwards. But in fact, what you're doing is still, you're still the same in a way. You don't change. Sorry, now I'm cracking myself up about making double entendre jokes.
Yes.
You're still the same. Nothing changes. You're still fixed in the block universe. You just know it now.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And your egoic state continues, just changed a little bit because you've got or changed a whole lot because you now also have the eternalism model of consciousness and self and time and world. And
but it's just a memory of a strong trip as opposed to a present reality of a currently ongoing trip.
Right. One able you can kind of revisit in, like you said, the future sessions, but then yeah, for society, like what's on the other side of repealing drug prohibition? Not much. Not much is different, except that drugs would be legal, and that's all. That's what in this area of life. That's what's needed.
And maybe that also religion would come to be understood on the adult level as opposed to the kind of believing in Santa Claus type of level, which the world currently adopts in its understanding of religion.
Yes, and that's what right. I think that's a related and but separate effect that's more dependent on. Well, that's more dependent upon the things like the Yuta theory spreading and being taken up more. Absolutely. That's what I would hope for and would work for. That's more of the work, right, is trying to spread that idea of what religion really is.
Yes. That's certainly what the ego death theory is trying to achieve.
Right. So I think that wraps up for me a lot of what I wanted to say, but that was, thanks, that was engaging. And I think helped sharpen a lot of what I was thinking.
So you suggested this topic in the first place because this is something that you were inspired to do following both the James Kent episodes that we did and then following subsequent analysis of those episodes that you have carried out. And to start with, I wasn't exactly sure where you were going to take this. I wasn't sure what you had in mind for talking about prohibition culture. But now I have a much clearer idea of what you're getting at. What I would like to do moving forward from here is to really closely analyze what the conversation that we have just had and then try to formulate a response to it. I feel in particular there's some issues that we haven't fully addressed and integrated into this discussion, such as Terence McKenna's thinking is something that I would like to explore a bit more deeply in relation to this. Also, the whole concept of mystery, initiation, secrecy in antiquity, and the parallels between that and modern prohibition.